Hello and welcome to Wide Angle. It has been a fortnight of a carnival of everyone looking east. And to this carnival we add three more. From my extreme right, we have Ambassador Prabhat P.Shukla. He was ambassador, in fact, in Australia also, other than Russia and various other places. Then we have scholar Zorawar D.Singh from King's College London and Sreeram, Professor Sreeram Chaulia from the Jindal University. Everyone's looking east, and so are you, gentlemen. The Prime Minister spent the last 10 days in Myanmar, then he moved on where he met bilateral, then he had Aung San Suu Kyi, then he had ASEAN, then he moved on to Australia. In Australia there was in Brisbane where there's a G20 and now bilateral, and of course the big gala show, and then he will move on before the week is out. He will have done Fiji. Meanwhile, and this meanwhile is important, during this period President Obama has been to Beijing. During this period, Mr. Putin, President Putin, has been sort of more or less embarrassed out of the conference at Brisbane. So lots is happening, whereas India is sort of cruising along at medium height. The big ones there seem to be some tension and quarrel. How do you look at this carnival of this last fortnight, Ambassador Prabhat P.Shukla?
Gosh, that's a big question. How do I look at this carnival? Look, I'd begin by saying that it's a good thing that we are not only looking east but acting east, which is a demand which many of our friends in ASEAN have been making to us, and which I think is something that we do need to bear in mind. What I would say is that our messaging has been rather good. We have very properly, I think, focused on the importance of the East Asia Summit while the Prime Minister was in Myanmar, because remember there are a lot of competing what in the European context is called variable geometry. There are lots of these geometries floating around in the Asia-Pacific region. Not all of them are in our interest. We are out of APEC, for example, and so we need to pick our way carefully through these different strategies and focus on those that are in our best interests. In that context, it's undeniable that countries like Myanmar and Australia, and I'm glad we have included Fiji, are going to be pivotal really in a very real sense for what we hope to achieve and what we want to do. However, the story is not one of undiluted good news according to me. I think I've made this point earlier on one of your shows. I believe that we need to be much more forthcoming on at least the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Chinese themselves are saying that all the other proposals are not going anywhere. The Chinese Deputy Foreign Minister was in New York and made a public pitch to be invited into TPP. We have been invited and we are hanging back. Can't for the life of me understand why. That is one thing, and I think the other thing we need to look at very carefully is what is happening to the US rebalance to the Asia Pacific. Somebody put it very colorfully that President Obama has pivoted away from the pivot. Is that true? And if it is, what is coming in its place? What do we need to do? And last and probably most important from my perspective, in all these partnerships that we are establishing, we must not lose sight of our fundamental interests. You know, it's all right we talk about freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight, which we must, and where we must be partners. But there is a flip side to it, and that is that if we face trouble on our land frontiers. And I think with China, things are more or less stable at a certain level of tension. But with Pakistan and especially Afghanistan, I can foresee big trouble. Now, are our partners in the Asia Pacific, starting with the United States, willing to play any kind of role in stabilizing this region and working together to safeguard our interests? These are some of the critical questions which I have in mind, and to which I don't think we have got adequate answers yet.
Yeah, you have actually cast your net wider than I thought you would, but you have moved to Afghanistan
Well, your
and
program's
Pakistan.
called Wide Angle, old chap.
Right, it is. That's why. So, no, that latitude is given you. There's no. I was having a word with Zorawar, and I was discussing some things with him, and he said, "Look, Putin, Russia, was virtually walking towards Europe, and he has now been thwarted, and he's walking away from Europe now. Of course, he's walked away. Meanwhile, in lieu of it, a sort of a Eurasian consolidation has taken place, which is the enormous amount of closeness between Moscow and Beijing. The billions and billions of dollars worth of trade and
Hydrocarbons.
That to me is a emerging central column. Am I exact? Why don't you?
Yeah. So let's go back to firstly how you posed the question, what's happening in this Asia Pacific, and then we'll come to how sort of the Russia factors also come in. So for a variety of reasons, we are seeing this entire extremely large space at a historical juncture. You see all the major powers, for a variety of reasons, reasserting some sort of influence or role in the Asia Pacific. The Chinese, after let's say keeping a lower profile, are beginning to translate some of their wealth into power and influence. At least they're seeking to do so. The United States recognizes that the Atlantic world for them, while still very important and strategic, the Pacific world is where the future wealth and generation and capabilities are going to come. They want to not restore, but at least preserve a hegemonic position that they've had. India has been saying look east, now the Prime Minister is saying acting east. We again recognize this. Russia, for slightly different reasons, though again they've been wanting to give prominence to the eastern vector. The conflict over Ukraine has certainly been a turning point for the Kremlin, and the argument that I made recently is that the westernizers, in a sense, have been trumped by the Eurasianists and the people who are trying to now recraft a new destiny for Russia. So that has brought them into an alignment with China, but I don't think it's an exclusive alignment. They're also supporting, let's say, Vietnam's military modernization. They would be open to a strategic partnership with the Indians, provided we are able to understand this new dynamic and not treat it as simply sort of an old Cold War kind of a block-based mentality. So there are lots of these factors playing out. The way I would say is, how should India pursue its interests is, firstly, you can't be, I would say the first point I'd make, don't be a one-trick pony. Don't let China be the center of your entire Asia strategy. And I think we're seeing some of that playing out. The Prime Minister is playing a far more subtle hand, like you said, sort of cruising at a middle altitude. He's not taking sides in these intramural disputes. His message is basically, one is geopolitical, that the periphery or the near abroad for India is important, and that will sort of be a stepping stone to playing a larger role in East Asia. So you can't bypass ASEAN, Myanmar, Bangladesh. The second point he's saying, and repeatedly, and these are the messages that are coming for several months, how can India's modernization, economic transformation be served by these multiplicity of power centers that are emerging, and what they can do for India? So I think India is playing a far more gradual and a sequential role, where you don't want to let the securitization of your Asia-Pacific sort of discourse trump what should be a developmental focus in our foreign policy.
Sreeram, Professor Chaulia, what do you... on the one hand, we are talking about, the Prime Minister is talking about the Asian century, right? Let me go to a very basic... You heard Ambassador Prabhat P.Shukla you had Zorawar. China somewhere lurks. This is blah, 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 but China. Can there be an Asian century without there being trust between India and China?
I think it's feasible to some
Without
extent.
having to have an Asian century without
yeah,
trust between
yeah,
these
because
two?
we are talking about a multipolar Asia and a multipolar world, right? So when we say multipolar Asia, it means that we will be our own power center, and at the same time, in some ways, we cannot avoid competition with the Chinese. Because at the end of the day, if we start industrializing as Mr. Modi wants us to, eventually we are going to be in search of the same resources and the same minerals, and we already are to some extent. So I think, see, we should be living with the idea that this whole bhai thing is over, but at least let's now have an accommodation so we avoid war and major conflict. But I think underneath that threshold, we'll continue to have struggles and tussles of spheres of influence and so on, because historically great powers have always behaved that way. And the Chinese often try to stymie us at various forums. And so I think it is obvious that...
Like example, for instance?
The Asian Development Bank was going to give us a loan for developing our northeast, and the Chinese were trying to prevent it, saying that it's disputed territory. Just to give you an example. So I think we need to be aware that, and then the Pakistan card has always played to try and bottle us down and to keep us boxed in as a subcontinental power only and not a major Asian power. So there is tension, and we should not
the subcontinental. Let me take you up on that, and in fact, what you're saying, I'll ask Ambassador Prabhat. Prabhat, I'll ask you this. Sreeram says just now, I'm sorry, I have a bad throat today.
That's all right.
He says that you've got to have, there will be competition between China, and there we have to, and the Americans have been saying something quite different. What they are saying is, if we are going to place our eggs in the Chinese basket to any limited extent, those eggs are already there. I mean, the amount of volume of trade that is going on is substantial. It is growing. You cannot stop it. You have to fly from here to Shanghai to see your traders doing things that you simply will never be able to stop. So these strategic lines that we draw sometimes run contra to the reality on the ground. Now, I'm talking something that I've seen.
Yes.
I've been to Shanghai and back, and I see these people coming back. How are you going to contain this? My impulse tells me that an Asian century is possible only with a degree of trust that there should be between Beijing and Modi, maybe Prime Minister Modi may be prepared for it. I don't see the intelligence there prepared for it yet. Am I right?
Saeed, before I answer that, may I just go back to something you said about Russia and China? I think you are on to something quite big. Russia is a reluctant partner all the same. They are in it, and they are in it to reap the economic benefits that they can, but they do understand that China is a long-term security concern for them, and the Russians are therefore also looking very carefully and very positively at the European connection. They have not given up on it. And there are plenty of countries in the Eurozone and beyond Eurozone in Europe, in the broader Europe. We tend to conflate the two usually, who share this view that Russia is an integral part of Europe. And I think for Putin that is vital, and in that Germany is the #1 concern. And he is not going to willingly let the Ukraine imbroglio get in the way of that. There is a separate game going on, which is Germany is breaking through the Balkans and Turkey onto the Middle East. That is a separate and rival strategy for the control of Eurasia, if you like. I'm here looking at Mackinder's notion of Eurasia. However, having said that, now to come to your point about India and China, listen, what I am seeing in the last 2 decades post-Cold War is a very peculiar state of flux. So you have a situation where I would say statement A, and I could prove to you the statement contra A equally easily. Equally, what you are seeing is that you have two countries which have fairly close economic engagement and yet are at strategic odds. Japan and China is a clear example. One of the leading investors in China is Japan, not the United States. And look how bad their strategic and political and diplomatic relations are. So we are living through a very peculiar period of flux. And which way the chips will fall, we still have to wait and watch. So this is by way of preface. As to where India and China are headed, look, I think until we have forward movement on the border question, there will be no trust between us. And I would add here that having seen and observed very carefully what Xi Jinping said while he was in India, and equally importantly what he said when he went back to Beijing to the armed forces, he seems to be a little more serious than previous presidents have been in terms of fixing the boundary question. So if we are able to achieve something in that direction, we could see the beginnings of a relationship of trust. And as far as the purely economic side is concerned, I think you are bang on. It's not something that governments can stop and prevent. But what we can do is argue for a more equal relationship so that areas where we are strong, pharmaceuticals for example, or services, particularly financial services, are open to us so that we can balance the exchanges between our two countries.
You've written something, I want to read it out to you and explain. Without overtly touting India as an alternative to China or the US, Mr. Modi's Act East policy will definitely ride subtly on the sentiment that there is a seat on the Indo-Pacific table which seeks to be filled. Can you dilate on that?
Yeah, you know, the Chinese shadow is so overwhelming in the Indo-Pacific, or the Asia-Pacific as the Chinese still like to call it, that for all the smaller and medium-sized players, we're talking about our Vietnams and Philippines, Japan, and so on, for all of them, even Australia, you know, it matters to have India there. So while we are not going there saying that we are here to, you know, crudely counterbalance the Chinese, what we are saying is that we are different from the Chinese in terms of us being a democracy, us having a lighter footprint, us usually not going right after the minerals and the energy, but developing a more people-to-people based, you know, civil society and media and journalists and parliamentarians. So we are different from the Chinese, and I think they will welcome us as a kind of a foil, because otherwise what you're talking about is, you know, it's a large Chinese lake, as they call it, you know, the South China Sea and the East China Sea and the surroundings. But rather what these smaller countries want is to have India there and in a way to expand their own options. So I tend to think that we are actually creating diplomatic freedom for all these countries, and we are providing public goods. It's not only the Chinese. President Xi Jinping has come out saying, I have an Asia-Pacific dream, which is to increase Chinese investments in the region and to provide public goods. But can Xi Jinping provide public goods to Burma, for example, which is democratizing right now? I mean, no. I mean, what support can Aung San Suu Kyi get from the Chinese? She'll get it from the Americans, but also from us, you know. So what support will Fiji get from the Chinese? Fiji is now moving towards democracy. So there are many countries there which need a kind of an Indian hand to help them along. And that's what I mean by there is a vacuum kind of thing. It's not really a vacuum, but it's a kind of a place. And we need to be strategically astute to occupy that and to play our card well. We can't bring the big bucks of the Chinese. We don't have the large military or naval presence there. But at the end of the day, that is how we gain leverage and peddle influence in that region.
I think the Act East, he was quite pointed about the 3,200 kilometer highway link from India, Myanmar to Thailand. I think that is a practical thing. It is something on the table. It's something not only on the table, it's something already happening. By 2018, it's likely to be complete. So therefore, he is talking of something which is kinetic, which is happening. And So it is not so much. So what you're saying, without articulating all of this, that we are there to sell democracy, like the West came here and said, look, take our democracy. We are there in the business of business, and in which democracies, we are a democracy, and people will draw some comfort from
See,
that.
when we train, for example, parliamentarians of Myanmar, or when we try to help Thailand for restoration of democracy in our own small, subtle ways, by training some of their media persons, this is where I think we are different, you know. I'm not saying we are anyway
No, you're
equal
right.
to the Chinese.
What do you say?
Yeah, so let me first respond to the concept between conflict and cooperation. This dialectic or this dilemma that you pose is not just an Indian dilemma. 17 out of 23 of China's neighbors, their largest trading partner is China. So in a sense that they are already cooperating. At the same time,
Vietnam
invariably, yes, Vietnam, Russia, Japan, United States. At the same time, they are at some level concerned that the momentum of China's growth should not translate into some sort of a suffocating presence. But they seem to be handling it pretty well. So we similarly need to draw upon a sort of a dialectical policy rather than, but to your specific point, how should you play your cards, and what Sreeram is talking in East Asia, I sometimes sense that our security discourse kind of bypasses the economic factor. Let's not forget the sinews of influence of the United States and China in the Asia-Pacific comes from their economic vibrance and vitality over several decades. The United States had that. It's losing it now. It's trying to sort of supplement it with maritime power. I don't know if it's going to work. The Chinese are not displacing American influence through military means whatsoever. Yes, they may be jostling for space on their immediate maritime frontiers, which is very normal. India would do the same if you had a superpower sort of flying into your special zones. But their real leverage that they have today in the Asia-Pacific is the economic factor. So if you were to play a premature role in the Asia-Pacific based on sort of maritime strength or this conception, you're bypassing the foundations of what a rising power ought to be doing, which is trade, investment, finance. And these are precisely the ingredients that the Chinese today are using to have a buy into their conception. They're not using coercion. They're using a model of persuasion that you buy into this model. And if it's not a win-win model, then states will find alternatives elsewhere. So you have to be willing to offer an alternative, and that's where the competition is. So it's a different kind. So globalization has posed a new security challenge to pursue influence when you can't fight with the state. You can't take it beyond a point. So the way nuclear weapons have created a stabilizing factor where force cannot go beyond a point between great powers, economic interdependence has also created limits. You look at the Japanese and the Chinese, they've just already restarted talks and normalization of the Senkaku, the IU Islands. Now the fact that they're doing that goes to the fundamental point that Japan is again going back into recession. So you're seeing you can't separate the economy from the geopolitics. It's all playing out together. And we have to recognize that.
Prabhat, the triangle, United States, China, India, is there. India, and Modi particularly, except APEC, where we are not members, I don't know if there has been a prime minister in history who has attended every multilateral fora that there is on earth, from the General Assembly, from the General Assembly to ASEAN to SAARC to now SAARC again in Nepal. He'll be going there, and now in all of this, so there is, you might say, he is casting his seed everywhere, and yet a certain line is also developing, and that line is, to come back to his point, the line is that there is a consistency in New Delhi, Tokyo, Australia, Washington. There is that. So if those who want to see, there is a theme. Otherwise, there's lots of other. As you said, that you were saying, in fact, you can say one thing and the opposite is also true.
Absolutely.
Here is an example.
Yeah, but you know, my own reading is that this is short term. Short term meaning in a historical perspective. because I don't believe that this can be sustained for too long. The kind of mixed relations that China has with everybody, Japan first of all, but equally with Taiwan, Vietnam, and many of the other ASEAN member states, it can't be sustained at this level. And there are two reasons. One, of course, that as has been pointed out, I think a lot of them are now looking to countries like India, also America and Japan, not forgetting these two. They'd like to have the additionality of India as a stabilizing factor. And that's where our democracy comes in. Lee Kuan Yew has actually advised the Chinese leaders, look, nobody is scared of India's rise. They are very scared of your rise. And you need to think about this. Why? What is the reason? And the reason is democracy.
And look who's saying it.
And look who's saying it, absolutely.
Lee Kuan Yew, the Democrat.
None other than Lee Kuan Yew, quite right. Now, as far as the triangle is concerned, I must say that I think we have not played it well at all. We have a genius for antagonizing both sides in any kind of issues,
Instead of keeping both sides happy.
Instead of trying to keep both sides happy,
now we are running out of time.
We put distance from both of them.
Yes.
And I think particularly with America, where there is no conflict of interest,
yes,
we do really need to work much harder.
On that note, Prabhat, Zorawar, Sreeram, I think we must terminate this discussion. What is happening, I think it's very hopeful. If you look at the gathering in Brisbane, you had Europe, 2.3%, 2.1% growth. You had EU, which is 1 point some percent. And then you have China, India, Indonesia, with 6 plus 7. That is, so you can all, if you look at the economies of all those who attended Brisbane Summit, you can more or less have a whiff of the future. On that note, goodbye.